We're going to talk today. We're going to talk today about negating critical affirmatives. So there's, common thing in debate is a lot of people, do a lot of prep for, the AFs that are resolutional, but a lot of teams, even some of the best teams in the nation, will struggle, and generally people suck at answering the KF. Most of this, in my opinion, is a result of people just not thinking about these arguments enough, and giving them the attention they deserve. Because consequently, there's a lot of bad practices in critical affirmatives. They're quite easy to exploit if you put thought into them, and you can find a lot of success in it. So in this, we're going to go through a few sections of, what you should look for in getting a critical affirmative. The first is planning out your arguments, whether that's preseason, pre-tournament, whatever it may be, how to, find a strategy. The second is the how of, sort of preparing that strategy. Third, execution. And then I'm going to have a special section of that, especially for cross-examination. And then we'll just go through general things to avoid. Before we start, I do have a quick question for y'all. You can put it in the chat or say it out loud if you want. But, there's a lot of ways to negate critical affirmatives. Do y'all have something you want me to focus on specifically, whether it's, going for the critique against a critical affirmative or, the normal clash, sort of framework cap, impact turns, if that's your thing. If you have one specific type of thing, I can make sure to sort of tailor some explanation towards it. You can put it in the chat. A few that say clash and framework, so that's good because that's a lot of the arguments I went for and debated against. So I feel pretty confident in my ability to do that. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is planning. The first thing I have is that you need to understand the thesis of various critical affirmatives in the context of preseason prep. A lot of K teams will they adapt similar lit bases to various methods to create apps, right? If you look throughout, the last few years, especially, people take literature bases that they're, familiar theories, and then think about its relationship to the topic and apply it that way. Well, I have a few gripes with this, way of constructing critical affirmatives. It's a fairly common one. So for instance, a team will say, subtle colonialism is something I'm really interested in, and then apply that to the water topic as well as the criminal justice topic. The easy way to think about these AFs is that usually their impact, explanation, etc., is not necessarily tailored to the topic, which is something you can exploit, which we'll discuss. Another sort of genre of AFs, which I think are a little more strategic, is that they start with a set of 2AC answers. So for instance, they'll take the framework argument, and then they'll find a 2AC to a water framework argument, and then construct their AF backwards. I think these AFs are a little more difficult to negate, especially with framework arguments, because they're built to answer your arguments. But in the context of these affirmatives, what the core thing you'll find is they have picked a point of disagreement that is likely strategic against yours. What I mean by this is, say, for instance, a team that does this super well is North Broward. If you look at the AFs they break, especially the new ones, they're very tailored to what the other team wants to do. So for instance, if a team really likes fairness and clash impacts, they have an AF specifically constructed against those. The big benefit that anyone can benefit from in the context of preseason, pre-tournament preparation against critical affirmatives is you should aim to be flexible. You should aim to be flexible. So you should not, and by flexibility, I don't necessarily mean honestly, you can just stick to framework if that's your thing, or the cap K if that's your thing, impact turns if that's your thing. What I mean by flexibility is also in how you explain your arguments. If you're going for framework, you should be willing to, switch from more procedural to skills impacts. If you're going for the cap K, you should, have multiple versions of this critique, one that is more reliant on framework and link, one that is more reliant on impact and alt. By doing this, you can more strategically sort of allow yourself to pivot against AFs that are strategic against the method that you're normally used to. The second thing that you want to consider is that you apply what you're good at, but be willing to be flexible. So for instance, if you're, a super technical policy debater that reads a lot of cards, your big thing is evidence and things like that. Something you might want to focus on is linking teams to impact terms, because that's the kind of debate that you're more familiar with and more strategic with. If you can force the debate to be on your terms, you're much more likely to have a better time against any form of AF. This all depends on you and requires an accurate assessment of how you debate as well as what you're good at. For other teams, if it's the critique, for instance, critiques versus critical teams is quite a bit different, which I'll discuss in the how section. But ultimately, the thing that you have to figure out is what is the core disagreement that I would take with the critical affirmative, and try to be as specific as possible in finding what that core disagreement is in the context of specific AFs. So, for instance, your 1 and C against the Afro-pessimism affirmative should look drastically different than your 1EC against like the Heidegger critical affirmative. If you have similar looking 1ECs against both of these two positions, you're doing it wrong for sure, because you're not deploying any, your core point of disagreement is not actually a disagreement with the thesis of the AF. What I mean by this is Afro-pessimism AF, a lot of teams will read like their 1 and C case will always say state good. We should learn about legal frameworks or whatever. This is like strategic against some AFs, but it's not strategic against other ones. I.e., it's not very strategic against the Heidegger AF to say state good when the 1EC likely has not posited really, that argument is not getting you much. So you want to be thinking about categories of AFs and then constructing points of disagreement within those. This is not to say you can't group AFs to say, I want to prep this set of AFs like this set of AFs like this, but that you need to carefully assess how your arguments interact, which will be a little below as well. But ultimately, the hardest part is you need to find a core point of disagreement that is applicable to a variety of AFs that actually disagrees with the AF, not just some premise that they all forward. So if your neg strat relies on the fact that they read their argument in debate, you are likely not going to have a good time. The wrong forum counterplan, even though applies to all critical affirmatives, it's not good neg generic, because every AF will have a unique angle, and it'll be and on top of that, they will have, presumably evidence as well as arguments specific to their AF, which for that argument, you just do not have those for the neg. So the next step is you want to be flexible, but at the same time, play to your strengths. The last thing I'll say about this section is that you need to think about how your arguments interact. I have unironically seen teams read arguments such as, the cap good and the cap K in the same 1 and C. This is like obviously a ridiculous example, because this team has clearly just thrown arguments out there, which is kind of what K teams want when they're AF. The whole goal is to throw you off, and if you can have if you're confused, right? The critical team has rehearsed their arguments over and over again against your set of arguments. So they'll be fine answering whatever you have to throw out. But if you, lose it all, you're going to struggle. Instead, you should concretely think about your strategy. For me, what this looked like was that I was going to sit down and basically, look through a variety of critical affirmatives that were previously successful, and then, assess what my strategy would be to all of these. Think about where is the core point of disagreement, and can I answer this argument with primarily I went for framework. So I would be like, could I answer this argument on framework? If I can't, then I need to think about what else I want to do. Perhaps it's the cap K or something else. But generally, you want to think about how your arguments interact with the affirmative. That'll be below in the sort of how section as well. So I think that's most of what I had to say for planning your strategies beforehand, or just your general approach to critical affirmatives. If someone has questions about this section before I move on, I can answer them.
How would you plan T against these things? You said like all like things shouldn't look the same, but I'm assuming that doesn't apply to T.
Well, even in T debates, it's often strategic to have various takes. So for instance, against the pessimism AF, you might want to have a heavy focus on, switch side debate, because, pessimism is, very sort of, it's negative in the sense that, it generates links to every AF, and it's sort of good for that, right? It doesn't really positive for a future outlook that is resolutional at all. So maybe against that AF, your core thesis is going to be switch side. Even if the 1 and C doesn't change, right? The way you explain your framework argument should be drastically different in the context of every AF that you debate. So the way I explain framework against pessimism cannot be the same as how I explain this against an AF that says like movements should do some water change. Because say, for instance, against pessimism, I make arguments about legal education and for movement building, right? You cannot make those same arguments against that other AF because they will always win the link turn. In the same way, the other team, right? If you make even clash arguments, you might want to have a heavy focus on switch side against the pessimism team, while against the other team, you need to spend more time establishing your counter interpretation, establishing offense to their counter interpretation. Why is it unlimiting given that they're probably going to play a more middle ground approach? So even if the 1 and C does not change, the way you explain your arguments should be drastically different. Something I always say is like, if you're giving the same overview every round, your overview is not meaningful. If you give an overview, that's a good thing. But because the explanation that you should have for each of these set of arguments, again, grouping them into categories, not necessarily every AF, you should be talking in terms of the AF, which I'll discuss a little bit. But does that answer your question? I'm gonna go with yes. Another thing, like another core example of this is like people do not think about what links they're reading on the CapK. A lot of AFs, a lot of 1 and Cs will just have like a card that says, I've seen so many times people just read like Afro-pessimism links against every AF that says anti-Blackness. And I mean, it's like bad not only for like the fact that this card is now useless for you, but also the fact that it just does not look good for your ethos, which is something that matters a lot in these debates, that you have a card like that. So carefully assess what you're putting in the 1 and C, and think about your arguments beforehand. Someone said, is a K affirmative and off that is good against a K argument? So a critical affirmative is one that generally does not defend a plan text, is sort of what we're discussing here when I talk about critical affirmatives. So an AF generally, that does not defend United States federal government action. There are a few critical affirmatives that do read a plan, but generally that's the big differentiating factor between them. So it's actually an AF argument, not necessarily that's good against a K argument, but an AF argument that is premised around critical literature. Other questions? All right. So now that you've got sort of this planning part down, the next thing we're going to discuss is that, how to construct any strategy. So there's 3 things that I think are relevant for constructing a strategy. The first and foremost, by far the most important thing you need to do is develop offense. Develop offense based on a core disagreement with the AF. When I say this, I mean this regarding everything, even if you go for framework, even if you go for topicality. you need to have some core disagreement with the F. I'm going to put this out there because I think it's an important question that you should all think about. So what do you think is the core disagreement with the F proper, the topicality posits? And it's not that they should have read the United States federal government.
Oh.
Should have defended the res. Okay. Yes, that's like the basic disagreement. But why does it disagree? Why does topicality disagree with the, not just, why does it disagree with the AF on another level? What I'm looking for is something, say the other team says, topicality is exclusionary, right? This should be the core of your argument here. Why does topicality disagree with the AF necessarily? They should have defended the res as part of it, but for what reason? Why should they have defended the res?
Oh, because debate is a game?
Because debate is a game, potentially. T argues that the AF's entire argument should be disregarded, not necessarily. What I'm looking for is topicality says that the affirmative team's departure from the resolution, right? The affirmative team's refusal of, say, predictability, right? The topicality is a critique of that. Topicality says that that is a worse way to engage the benefits of debate. And often that means they have a competing theory of debate itself. What are the goals and values of debate? And what should we seek to achieve in debate? So when you said, debate is a game, they should have defended the res, etc. That is true. But the core disagreement here is that debate, say, for instance, is not activist, is not a space for activism necessarily, but it is a space, it is a game, which means we should care most about the sort of competitive equity between two teams. That is the disagreement between your AF and the neg strategy. And that is the core disagreement that you should play on for the rest of the debate. Finding one or two core points of disagreement is extremely important because it allows you to center the debate around the central question, which is especially important in critical debates. The reason I think this is because all of debates against critical affirmatives, most of it is who can control big picture issues. It is not necessarily decided in technicalities most of the time. Critical affirmative debates are not decided on technicalities, or they're decided at the big picture level, which means when you're thinking about what your argument is, whether it's topicality, the cap K, right? The cap K might be a simple question. Say I'm reading the Afro-pessimism affirmative, right? What is the core disagreement between the cap K and Afro-pessimists? Marxist cap K, right? Like the Marxism K versus the pessimism K. State engagement, that could be one core disagreement, and you could structure your critique around that. Yeah. What's potentially another one? You have a different theory, right, of how sort of the world is structured. So you can make your disagreement primarily centered around that. Your disagreement could be centered around the question of materiality or materialism. So these are points that you need to identify prior to debate and prior to even thinking about your strategy. While setting up your strategy, you should think about where do I disagree with the AF and how can I win that difference? Oh, there's not really a difference. I just meant I just used two words that were synonyms. Yeah. But the first step you want to do is find your core disagreement with the AF that would develop offense for you. And then you should stick to that. oftentimes what people do against KFs is they'll be like, no wink, right? This is not us. This is not us, without explaining why they disagree. This is especially common in a lot of critical debates, for instance, right? And you should be willing to stand your ground and be like, this is where we disagree. And this, if we win this question, we win the debate. So that's the first step, develop offense. The second one is develop framework or framing arguments to prioritize your offense. Develop framework or framing arguments to prioritize your offense. So for instance, this is especially relevant in sort of, KVK debates, because the central question you've identified, say I'm neg this time going for Afro-pessimism versus Marxist cap af, right? The question I want to avoid, the one I'm scared of, right, is if they make the debate about sort of, material consequences, because then their impact will likely outweigh mine. So I want to set up framework or framing arguments around my core disagreement, say at the level of scholarship, for instance, or, theorizing the world, right? Debate should be a question of theory, not of praxis, could be sort of my framework argument. This way, I'm setting up the debate on my terms, on the central offense that I've posited. This applies the same, though, if you're going for, say, topicality or an impact turn. If you're going for an impact turn, you want to avoid questions like, say you're going for the hedge good impact turn. You want to avoid questions around, well, is hedge good scholarship good or bad? You want to avoid those epistemological indicts, right? Because that's where the AF likely wants to hedge its bet. Instead, you want to put it around the central question that you're interested in, which is usually centered around, say, extinction outweighs or the material consequences of the affirmative, which you've impacted. So you should set up framework arguments or framing arguments that prioritize that in impact calculus. Time frame, magnitude, probability are not very relevant for these debates, because in reality, whoever wins the framework is much more likely to win those debates regardless. Say, for instance, if the AF posits that, we need to, if the AF is about, the Afro-pessimism, you're not going to win because you outweigh the AF on magnitude. You're going to win because you won the debate should be centered around questions of, material consequences, and then your cap impact outweighs because of that. So second step after you found your core disagreement is make a framework or framing argument. Also apply this to topicality. In the context of topicality, you need to make your argument about what is the role of debate, and then answer that question. So one thing that I like to do is say, the sort of central question of this debate is about, what if we win our arguments about the role of debate, then essentially the judge needs to prioritize what model leads to the most depth of clash and specific argumentation to maximize the benefits of debate. So you should set up framework and framing arguments around your core disagreement. The last part is you should strategically then make your alternative and or your sort of interpretation and standards around these core disagreements. So if you're neg, you want to set up your alternative to solve whatever your framework argument is in an intelligent way that avoids AF offense and vice versa. Are there any questions?
So how do you know if like a K makes the statement like material consequences don't matter? Like would you like give
How
me
do you know?
Yeah, like because you're saying like, oh, just some that material consequences like do matter. What if they're just like, yeah, it does matter? Like, how do you know that they're like saying material consequences don't matter?
Well, this is step one, which is you need to accurately assess the affirmative to determine what your core disagreement with the AF is. If their argument is that material consequences matter a lot, then your core disagreement with the AF cannot be on the question of materiality.
But how would you figure out if, like, could you give me an example of an AF that says material consequences don't matter? except like for the obvious pessimism ask.
I mean, a lot of AFs that focus on, say, an epistemological interrogation of X thing. In those AFs, the material consequences are unlikely to matter as much as, the theory part of sort of theorizing. And you can apply that to a variety of concepts. There's, say, like settler colonialism affirmatives that say some of this sometimes. Does that help? I will say this requires you to understand the AF, and oftentimes critical AFs, right, especially, people can have the same evidence set, the same lit base that they're drawing from, and present their arguments in debate in drastically different ways. So this requires you to, communicate with other debaters on your circuit, communicate with maybe judges, and maybe watch debates to learn how is that team articulating their position in order to construct your negative strategy, which is just, part of the difficulty. The other thing you can do, however, you can sort of use this to your advantage. If both teams have drastically different understandings of a lit base, right, you can essentially read for yourself, right? Reading is incredibly important, and come to a determination. And often teams will be double turning themselves with one of these explanations. And then you can exploit that to your advantage and use a double turn as the basis for your negative strategy, which is incredibly difficult for the AF to answer. Does that make sense?
Wait, could you repeat that?
Yeah. So teams, even with the same lit base or EV, can often come to drastically different conclusions or different approaches to explaining that argument, any argument, whatever it may be. What this means is that you should be willing to just do the research and learn what is it that this lit base or EV set says, and use it to create double turns or explain double turns to the affirmative strategy. So for instance, if a team is reading like two authors that definitely disagree with each other a lot, which actually happens a lot more than you'd think, because critical AF 2As know that they can get away with a lot given how little people think about their arguments. You can use that to your advantage and exploit it. And this is not relevant to just the 1AC. Some teams, for instance, will read like a Wilderson card in the 2AC, even though to impact turn, say, fairness, for instance, but the rest of their AF certainly does not agree with that. So you can use that to your advantage and say, this argument actually, demonstrates this is our link to our criticism, and this is the core disagreement we have. All right. Now I'm going to go through a few examples of arguments that I think things to avoid, and then things that you should prioritize more when prepping critical affirmatives. First, things to avoid. The argument that there's no perms in method debates. The reason I think this argument is heavily overrated is because any competent AF team should be able to answer it with either one of two arguments. One, most negative arguments are about, we should do things collectively. If that's your argument, then no perms in method debates takes two compatible strategies and then decides to, take away them. Two, the idea that you should get rid of all forms of competition means the neg would never have to win a link and they could do AF plus every debate, which is obviously a terrible model for debate. So this argument is heavily overrated because the only time it ever matters is if it is literally entirely dropped. The thing that I think is a much better argument is just to set the threshold with your framework arguments for what it takes to beat the permutation. Permutations obviously win a lot of, KVK debates for the AF. And the way to beat that is to set the threshold. You have to set a competing threshold for the permutation and say something like, you should not let them shift out of this. And any risk of a link we win means that the AF is severance and our net benefit outweighs. Setting a frame like that then means that setting a threshold like that makes it a lot easier for you to beat the permutation than no perms in a method debate. The second argument that I think everyone should, try to avoid, or this second practice, I guess, is that teams read way too much in the block, go for way too much in the block into an R. I'm not opposed to proliferating in the 1NC against critical affirmatives, especially given how sort of shifty they can be. But by the block into an art, you should be collapsing significantly. Otherwise, it's actually much easier for critical affirmatives because they always, can spin their way out of things. So you want to avoid that. Now, things that I think you should, the last thing of things to avoid is making super generic arguments. And this is a big ethos thing as well, especially if you have a judge that, is a little more left-leaning. It is important for you to sound like you've listened to the other team's arguments or directly responding to them, instead of reading your generic blocks, which, give off the vibes that essentially you don't care. And those really matter because of something I'll explain below. But some things that seem like this are when you get up and you're like, all, critiques are unpredictable and it requires us to read a lot into their lit base, which they will always do, they will always do more of, which makes it impossible for us to be neg. Framing your arguments like this is not as helpful because you're not really listening to very much their arguments. Or when you say, some people read things from other topics, right? So they'll be like, the CJR topic gives us one thing, or on the cap K, they'll make arguments like, this is like especially common on the cap K, where people's link arguments are essentially just root cause arguments that are poorly explained instead of contextualizing them to the AF whatsoever. Or for example, they'll say like identity politics is bad without contextualizing that to the 1AC. So an example of a generic argument that you can then make way more focused is, let's take the cap K, for example. Instead of saying the 1AC focus on identity politics is fragmenting, right? You should focus on, say, if it's the Afro-pessimism critique, you should say the 1AC's failure to, posit a material praxis that is committed to organizing and commitment to endless theorizing locks in a cyclic cycle of, or it locks in a cycle where we are relegated to the status quo instead of affirming new worlds and new modes of politics that may not be what structure politics now. Anti-capitalist resistance requires a political commitment that cannot be, requires a concrete political commitment, which the AF is antithetical to and is explicitly, disregarded in favor of endless theorizing and passivity in the face of violence. This is a far more focused argument that applies a somewhat generic argument, but puts it in the terms of the 1AC, which you should always be aiming to do. Which was actually the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is the things that win these debates are examples and contextualization. The reason for this is because all debate, but especially critical debate, is at some level about storytelling. It's how can we, best explain our arguments in a way that tells coherent story that, is better than the other teams, in this case, the AFs. What this requires, especially in this debates, is you to move away from vague, abstract statements and into the specifics. this is what I was referencing when I said you need to sound like you referenced the other team's arguments and you're listening to them and put your arguments in terms of theirs. If y'all, I don't know, watch a lot of debate, right? Someone that was really, really good at this was He-Man from Harvard MS. If you can, you should go watch him on YouTube. He talked very explicitly in the terms of the affirmative and then used that language when he was answering it. He made his arguments extremely contextual to that. And he said, they will win this argument, but our, impact outweighs, for instance. And using that frame is extremely important to demonstrate that you've put a lot of thought into it, but also that you're contextualized to force you to contextualize your arguments to that specific affirmative. If you're able to do that, it also makes it way more difficult for them to spin out of things, which is what KAFs are known to be able to do. It's part of their benefit, right? And one, place that I think Joe mentioned was you want to think about CrossSex questions. You should, a lot of teams plan out all their strategy, but they don't plan out their CrossSexes, which is especially important against these apps. Some, CrossSex questions is also, I put it here, but this is also the things to avoid section. Critical app 2As especially love it when you ask questions like, why vote AF? What is insert 1AC advocacy text? What you're doing when you ask these questions is you're allowing the AF team to get X number of minutes or whatever, or seconds, to explain to their judge away from their cards what exactly the affirmative's thesis and their advocacy is. In a way, in a slow form, they get to talk to the judge. This is a terrible way of conducting CrossSex. Instead, what you should do is you should ask closed-ended questions that pin them down to forcing them to answer the arguments that your arguments are best at answering. So, for instance, what one argument you can, spend some time on is what is the 1AC's, answer to X situation. So you could say, if you're going for the capitalism critique, you could say, what is the 1AC's orientation to organizing, a certain type of organizing, right? Or you could ask questions like, does the 1AC and how does the 1AC defend X, or does the 1AC agree with this premise? This forces teams to, link to your offense, which is where every 2A wants to get away from. And you should definitely think about CrossSex more in establishing a link to your arguments to avoid shiftiness. And the other thing, though, is you cannot just have the CrossSex moment, because all 2As are liars. So they're going to try to get away from it. You should write down. One thing I always did was at the top of any doc, any 2NC I made, I had CrossSex. And then I would take notes about things in CrossSex, quotes from exactly what they said. Then later in my speeches, I would say, they cannot no link this. X person said in CrossSex, quote, insert quote, and then said this. And, that's way more persuasive. The judge is going to be like, yeah, I remember that CrossSex moment. And they said a quote from it. Like, yeah, there's definitely a link here.
Well,
another thing you can do is...
I didn't catch that. What'd you say?
You can, once you get your CrossSex moments, you should take notes on what they said in CrossSex, especially quotes, right? Or especially helpful of what exactly they said in CrossSex, and then reference that later in your speech. It's not sufficient to just have a good CrossSex. You have to reference that and use CrossSex to win later in your speeches, which is the next step. So write down what they say and then reference that in your speeches. Be like, in CrossSex, they said this, so they can't no link. And or, right, preferably both, you should use quotes from their evidence as well, right? So you should be like, their evidence says this, and they are responsible for their evidence. Does that make sense? All right. any questions about this part of it? This was sort of the execution section. Right. Now, the last things I have is just a few things that I think are, extremely important that you should, general things. I had the things to avoid section. Now I'm going to go into things to do and some arguments that I think are, somewhat underrated. So things to do. The first is you should exploit the fact that the net AF is unlikely to win theory. Right? Because most of the AF theory arguments with the policy affirmative rely on some sort of fairness or strat skew impact, neither of which are very accessible for a critical firm. So what I would do is, at least for me, if I'm judging, and I think a lot of judges, it is difficult to convince me that, or your judge, that a KF does not have to defend something. They got to pick and choose what to defend, and thus should be held responsible for it. So, picks, right, with a K or a C really, can be extremely helpful in these debates. Because what is the other team going to say? No, we should not care about how rhetoric informs our advocacy. Not an accessible argument for them. Picks bad. What's the impact to that? Probably not as accessible for them, although it is, they'll have a take on this for sure, but it's going to be easier for you to win that. A common argument that's grown now is frame subtraction, which I don't really hate because it's a series of picks that you can modify over time. So if the two AC double turns themselves, you can pick out of that, which is pretty cool. The other thing is, so you should exploit the fact that the neg cannot, or the AF cannot really go for theory, and make you should steal the AF as much as possible through picks and frame subtraction and the like.
To be clear, one is what is frame subtraction, and two, what are actual good picks? Because I've heard of the theory of pick, do this without this one specific one. What's a good what are good generic picks? Or they don't have to be generic, just examples.
Yeah. I will say generic picks are a little weird. The weird, actually there's a few that I think are kind of interesting. There's the res pick, which essentially says the 1AC didn't have anything to do with the resolution. And so there's no net benefit to including it. It's only a reaction to what has already been posited, and a far more radical gesture is to completely disregard the call to order of the resolution altogether. Second one is becoming extremely popular is the pick out of the Atlantic centrism, which is there were slave trades other than sort of just on the Atlantic. So it's a homogenizing narrative to posit that we should use the Atlantic slave trade as the basis for any theory. So those are two examples. Yeah, I think frame subtraction was answered in the chat, but essentially it's picks. Think of it as a pick, but you can add or subtract frames. Essentially, frame is just something that the affirmatives committed themselves to defending.
So what would be an example of that?
Well, any of these picks can be, frame subtractions themselves. But then say I started the 1AC with, the Atlantic pick as my, as a frame subtraction out of the Atlantic centrism in the 1AC, that frame, and we agree with all the other frames. Then in the 2AC, they made another argument that was the academy is good, or the university space is good. And then in the 2NC, I could subtract out of that frame and say university bad.
Okay.
So the benefit to this frame subtraction is that it's like a pick, but it's not just to the one AC. It's out of anything the AF defends across the debate, and you agree with the rest of it.
So you can edit it in the 2NC. So like 2NC, I put in the subtraction. They say some not base stuff in the next speech, and I just like, oh, edit frame subtraction, editor's notes.
Yeah.
I don't like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, this argument's like still like under development, I guess is like a way of saying it, where a lot of teams would explain it in various different ways, but this is like the general thesis, and you can like put your own spin on it.
Okay, so on picks, I heard of picking out of authors. One, like picking out of authors removes like some of that card. So like, is there a way to just replace authors? Is that like, because I feel like that's just like a much
safer. Yeah, you can say like, instead of this, you know, author, we think we should endorse, you know, this other person's work. That's like something you could do. Yeah.
Right. So like the AF, but like, so that would just be a pick out of an author and replace it with another one.
Yeah, you could do that.
Okay. And I guess, do people go for T like against? Because you didn't talk much about T in your thing.
Yes, so like, T is like easily the most common 2NR against these positions, but I actually think everything I've said here is actually equally applies almost to topicality. You should think of your topicality position as a critique of something that the 1AC has done. Find your core disagreement with what the 1AC has done. If it's that, you know, we think that debate is the space, is a game with the benefits of that game are that, you know, we will learn research and skills based on the ability to have in-depth clash and develop specific strategies. The 1AC's mechanism of presenting itself in debate through, you know, not through the resolution, its refusal of predictability undermine that goal, and thus we think our model, right, is better. That is our core disagreement with the F. And then you should still, all your framework impact turns should be in the context of the 1AC, or your answer should be in the context of the 1AC and their impact turns, not just about, you know, your thing. So everything I've said here applies just as much to topicality. But I do have a few like topicality takes that I'm gonna, you know, speed through here a little because I know we're running out of time. Just things that you should do. The first was like the, you know, you exploit theory. Second, go for presumption. You should press the AF on its ability to solve. You know, vague assertions is what most apps do, and you should hold them to the basic method they've defended, and CrossSex can be especially helpful for this. 3, if you're comfortable with it, go for topic DAs and impact turns if the app links, or better yet, you can even link them to it by pulling lines from their tags, especially where they try to talk about the topic and then say this means will impact turn this premise. AF responses are usually woefully insufficient because they're not ready for these debates, so you can exploit that. Fourth, you should, I'm going to talk about, you know, topicality a little bit here. You should think about this argument a lot more than people really do now. If your core against all of these apps is topicality, then you should, you know, and a lot of your debates are against critical affirmatives, you should especially be thinking about it. You should sort of frame their approaches in a few different ways, and I'm going to talk about them here. Either A, the affirmative team will try to impact turn topicality. Here, solely an impact turn. If this is true, what you should do is you need to focus on the question of solvency. You should talk about how does an AF ballot remedy your impact turn, given you do not have a counter interpretation in order to remedy that. Or if they do, how does the counter interpretation remedy an impact turn, say to all of predictability, right? If they've impact turn predictability, then the counter interpretation advances some form of predictability as well. Or they will find a middle ground approach, right? Well, they'll say the counter interpretation with a content impact turn. Here, you should focus less on the question of solvency and more on getting limits to sets to their counter interpretation and then answering or turning affirmative impact traits. So, those are my tips for how you should, group affirmative strategies generally, and what approaches I think are best there. I think that is all the things that I wanted to cover, do's and don'ts. So that I'll take any questions, remaining questions.
So with so I guess it's like a two-part question. Like, how much time should you read? And I assume you guys don't read like whole books just to have like one author insight. So what's the quickest way to like find out if someone's like bad, or they give a bad take, or they do something bad?
Well, to be honest, like most critical affirmatives wouldn't read an author that's like really problematic generally, just because like there's zero strategic benefit for them to do that. Their whole like thing is like we're super, ethical or whatever, and we've posited good scholarship in debate as their impact term to T. So it is highly unlikely that you find an AF that has like a bad author in it.
Well, say like someone reads none, right? But their K doesn't say the state is bad. You can just be like, pick out of the author, read state good. None says state is bad. And but the fact I know that none doesn't like the state is because other people told me that. So how do I find my own author insights? Like, do I just buy like a lot of books, or do I specifically like?
Well, this can be done through a lot of, what this sounds like is I'm pretty sure the way they found most of that is you read AF evidence first. So that's the first step. You should read, the full text of the AF evidence, especially where they've cut it from, and then read the context surrounding it. If you want, then you can, if you find something, you can then look at their other work, but you don't necessarily have to read entire books just to negate certain AFs. Reading like a reader can help often, and also like the way they explain their argument should give you context for how you should conduct the research regarding that specific AF. I don't necessarily think, reading is good, but I don't necessarily think you have to read like tons of books to find a core disagreement with an AF, because if the AF is smart, they would have presented that, and then you just need to read for a core disagreement. You don't need every detail ever about that author. In fact, being that nitpicky can actually hurt you, because you're not actually disagreeing with the core thesis of the AF. You're making a nitpicky thing that they're just going to be like, well, we don't, that part of this author's thing is not relevant for this debate. Yeah, exactly. Critiques of arguments the AF has defended are much more persuasive than like random indicts to an author. Like, think about it this way. If I read some AF and then someone was like, well, like, Wilderson, if I read like the Afro-pessimism AF, and then, Wilderson, someone was like, well, Wilderson was once paid off by like this corporate person. So yeah, like no one cares. Literally no one.
But isn't that like a part of the reps thing where it's like, all right, if you like find a better author that says the same thing with like equally as valid warrant?
No, because the AF has defended their method. This is like a nitpicky thing, and they might actually win theory here. And then they're also gonna develop offense to the fact that you picked out of their one author, and replaced it with someone else. Like, I would not find this very persuasive, simply because you're not disagreeing with what the AF said. You like found another author that says the exact same thing. And usually if they said the exact same thing, they build on the other person. This is similar to like if an AF said, we should disregard everything Calvin Warren has to say because he cites Heidegger, who was a Nazi. Like, no one is voting on this earth, because it's just not relevant to the AF. You need to find a core disagreement with something the AF actually defended. Other questions?
Does that argument apply equally to like unhighlighted, ununderlined lines a part of the card?
A lot of this is dependent on your judge. I personally think that like you should get links to it, but if you're gonna like pick out of like a random part underlined part of their card, it's like probably not that great for you. Just don't try to make everything a minor disagreement. You're gonna end up losing because you do not have a disagreement with some core thesis part of the AF. You need that to develop offense because otherwise any risk of the AF offense will outweigh your minor disagreement. Yeah, they should disagree with a decent portion of the AF. The reason they're strategic is because, say, for instance, if the AF is like, you don't have to, you can steal a lot of the AF solvency mechanism while disagreeing with one of their premises. But when I'm saying this, I don't mean like they used X word, that's bad. Word picks are not very useful for anyone. I would not use like a word pick. I don't think that's a very strategic. Unless the word is in like their advocacy text, then they would have to defend it, Any other questions? If anyone has anything, they can put it, they can like reach out to me. I'm not sure how we're doing things here, so I'll wait before I like give out contact information or anything, but feel free to reach out and I'm happy to answer any questions.